Good morning, and I hope you can see me on screen. So welcome to this opening plenary of the We Value Nature 10-day challenge. I'm Guy Duke, I'm Director of We Value Nature. We're delighted to have brought together an outstanding program of over 40 sessions for this 10-day challenge. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. While our 10-day challenge focuses on how businesses can move from ambition or commitments to action, this opening session addresses the why, taking into account the direction of travel here in the European Union and globally in the context of climate and the nature agenda. We'll be hearing this morning from a panel of leading proponents of business action for nature, and I'll introduce them a little later. Before the end of today's session, we'll also provide a rapid orientation to the 10-day challenge. But first, let me invite Richard Spencer, who's Director of Thought Leadership at the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, to give a short introduction to We Value Nature and our 10-day challenge. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Guy. And so just to add my words of welcome to Guy, two guys. And
please add, could you open your video, Richard?
Yeah, it's saying I can't do that because you've disabled it. Oh, there we go. Wonderful. So, well, I'd just like to add my words of welcome to guys. And it's wonderful to see so many people joining what I believe will be a fantastic programme of events over the next 10 days. So who is We Value Nature? We are a small consortium in the world of consortiums under EU funds, and we are WBCSD, IUCN, OPLA, and ICAEW, so a collection of acronyms. It's a campaign funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 fund. And our goal is to engage businesses and financial institutions that are starting out on their natural capital journey and help them overcome the barriers to take up of capital's thinking and embedding nature and nature-based solutions into decision-making. We're a campaign, therefore, that supports and promotes the excellent work of the Capitals Coalition. Please do take some time to have a look around our website, www.wevaluenature.eu, at the assets we have there. Thought leadership ones, virtual workshops, media library. It's a fantastic collection. So the 10-day challenge has been brought together by We Value Nature and our partners for all, whether you're setting out on your journey or whether you're well down the road and completed your first assessments or embedded the lessons that you've learned into your organisations. We've got a variety of types of session to suit everybody's ways of working: plenaries, panel sessions, technical sessions, training, run by leading practitioners and thinkers in natural capital. Most of all, the 10-day challenge will be a great deal of fun, and I hope you enjoy it and get an opportunity to learn, to share your thinking and your experience, and to make new friends. Finally, I'd like to thank the team that have worked so hard to pull this together. And in particular, I want to name check Katia Bonga, Caroline Boltensling, and James Atkinson, who've done an absolutely brilliant job. Please, and do enjoy the next 10 days. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you very much, Richard. And perhaps, James, you can let me just reopen my video. Thank you. So thanks very much, Richard. And we'll now turn to our panel. And each of our panelists will make a brief statement of 4 or 5 minutes, and we'll then run a panel debate. We'd be delighted to take questions from the audience. So we'll take those questions after the 4 panel statements. So while you're listening to these panel statements, please do enter your questions using the Q&A function in the Zoom. Please don't use the chat function in the Zoom to put your questions. We'll only be monitoring the entries in the Q&A function. So that should be on the bottom right of your set of icons. So first up, we'll have Humberto Delgado Rosa, who is Director of Natural Capital at the Directorate General for Environment at the European Commission, to speak on the European Green Deal and what that means for business and nature. So Humberto, we are delighted to have you with us this morning, and over to you.
Hello, Guy. I hope you all listen to me well, and thank you very much for having me and address some words on this. So let me go directly into the subject for my 4 or 5 minutes. The first point being, why do we have an European Green Deal after all? Where did it come from? And my preferred explanation is, well, the facts from science is that indeed there is an ecological crisis out there, which is climate change and much beyond the rest of the environment, the biodiversity crisis, a crisis of extinctions. But most importantly, many people notice, let's say, the facts and the perception of the facts tend to run together. There are extreme weather events, plastic in the ocean, declining insects, forest fires. So there's a huge part of the public opinion, including the youth, that has stepped in, that had some electoral results in Europe, including for the European Parliament, and that explains the European Green Deal, in my view. It's a political response to this societal evidence or perception that there is an environmental crisis that needs to be addressed. Now, the Green Deal is another important element for our discussion because, yes, of course, it is a climate and environment strategy, but it's more than that. It is also the economic strategy for innovation, for growth, for recovery. And it's also a social strategy with this element of a just transition for those that can face bigger difficulties in the transition to sustainability. And now, what this means for nature? Well, I think the Green Deal and also, let's say, the political impulse from the current Commission does bring nature and biodiversity tendentially to the same level of priority as climate change, as two intertwined challenges that need to be tackled together. Actually, we were told, we perceived the political guidance to make the EU lead to address biodiversity loss as it has done for climate change. And that explains that we have now in the EU the most ambitious biodiversity strategy the world has ever seen, the one we have for 2030, with many implications for business. Now, this could all, of course, be a EU fantasy, or no, the EU ahead, but no one really cares. But it doesn't seem to be so if you take into account just a few months ago, we had UN General Assembly with so many heads of state and government endorsing the goal to address nature in a different way. We have seen this leaders pledge calling for assuming big commitments on protection of nature. And we have seen business coming in, for instance, this business for nature with some 560 companies calling for action from governments. And recently, the influential Das Gupta report that also shows what this means economically in a very clear way. Then we could say, oh yeah, but the pandemics came in, so where goes now nature and biodiversity? Well, it stays there because there's a link between nature destruction and the risk of pandemics, and everyone has understood this link and also the need that we do have for more nature in our lives. So what's the key issue for businesses? I would say in general, it is to integrate nature and biodiversity into their decision making. I won't go in the estimates of just what is the economic value generation that directly derives from nature. On this, and the country can probably refer to. What I will say is, first, this economic potential is not going unnoticed, including from many businesses asking for action and taking their own action. And we in the Commission, what are we working on that is relevant for business in this context? A lot of strands of work, the new revised sustainable finance strategy, the so-called taxonomy regulation to define what are sustainable investments, the review of the non-financial reporting directive, We're also considering in the Commission new rules for sustainable corporate governance. We are working in DG Environment in a green claims initiative to ensure that who claims I'm green follows the appropriate methodology. We have this EU Business and Biodiversity platform in which we are intensifying with business the engagement towards having better methodologies for measurement approaches for business to understand, measure, and account the relationship with nature. And in this context, I particularly expect key contributions from a live project that we are doing. We call it Transparent, in cooperation with the Value Balancing Alliance, which will develop more aligned and more standardized methods for natural capital accounting. So to end up, I do think that accounting for and measuring the business relationship with nature in all decision making will have to become the new normal. And it's through giving to corporate decision makers comprehensive techniques, methodologies, capacity to have a comprehensive insight into both the impacts and dependencies of their products and processes on overall natural capital, air, water, land, biodiversity, that will be key. So accounting for natural capital will be key, and it's through it that we can assess, measure, value, account, and use all this as an enabler to manage and reduce the footprint of business on nature. Thank you, Gail. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Humberto. And my apologies, we seem to have been getting a little bit of background noise during your presentation. I heard you loud and clear, but apologies to the audience if there was a bit of disturbance there. Thank you so much, Humberto, and for giving us those insights on the Green Deal and what it means for nature and for business, and for highlighting some of the initiatives that the Commission is taking in that regard. We'll move on to our second panelist, and we move now to Diane Holdorf from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Diane is the Managing Director of Food and Nature at WBCSD, and will focus on business engagement in the run-up to the next Conference of the Parties, COP15 of the CBD and the post-2020 Biodiversity Framework, and what this means for business. Diane, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Guy, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to join everybody today for this really exciting opening panel of the We Value Nature 10-Day Challenge event. I'm excited because this is going to be a very interesting program over the next few days, highlighting the important role that, in this case, the private sector plays in transitioning towards an equitable, nature positive, and net zero future. As you said, I represent the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, one of those acronyms that Richard listed off at the beginning when he was introducing the sponsors. Just for those who aren't familiar with us, we are a global CEO-led organization of over 200 leading businesses working together to accelerate the transition to a sustainable world, including the topic that we're addressing today, how we move to nature positive. As we all know, 2021 is a key year for the sustainability agenda, with the first ever UN Food Systems Summit organized for this coming September. Of course, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, COP15 coming up in Kunming, and the UNFCCC COP26 coming up in Glasgow later this year, where we are sure to see much more of an integrated climate agenda. We have quite a bit happening on this really important cross-cutting topic of nature. We know that nature will show up into all of these key events. Of course, most notably during the CBD COP15, where countries are likely to adopt a new global agreement on nature, which is being called the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is going to make clear how the world is going to have to act quickly to protect, restore, and conserve nature in the coming decade. Part of the challenge that we're facing and why this is so urgently needed is that the Aichi biodiversity targets, which were set previously, were not met, none of the 20 of them. And this is, of course, a huge challenge. Current data shows us that we're still outstripping nature's ability to keep up with supplying the services and the products on which all of us depend. And as Umberto referenced, the Dasgupta report highlights that we're going to need to embed nature into our decision-making processes to ensure that nature is able to keep providing these services. Policy has, of course, a huge role to play, as Umberto was saying, but the business case for action is also clear. We can't afford to go another decade without high ambition and very specific actions to halt and reverse nature loss. The business community has been actively advocating for adoption of these ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Business for Nature, which is a huge group of organizations in which WBCSD is proud to help host, as a founding member, has been a real driving force in mobilizing the business voice into the CBD processes. Last year, Business for Nature launched its overarching 5 policy recommendations. These are important. Let me list them for you quickly. The first, adopting targets to halt nature loss, ensuring policy coherence, valuing and embedding nature into decision-making, reforming subsidies and incentive schemes, and lastly, ensuring that we find the ways to empower all actors to take the actions needed. Building on these policy recommendations, Business for Nature engaged more than 100 businesses to prepare a business proposition and a position on the current CBD Zero draft text. This is the draft basis for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And just last week, leading businesses presented their 9 suggestions with specific text amendments to policymakers with a view to strengthening the ambition of the current framework, including, to provide a clear role for business and financial institutions, and to set an overarching mission to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. This builds on Business for Nature's prior policies and creates even more momentum on this call to action. Nature is everyone's business, through which 700 companies have already taken the steps to sign up to urge governments to adopt policies now to reverse nature loss. One of the ways specifically that companies are supporting the transition to an equitable, net zero, and nature positive future is through taking action on nature-based solutions. In December of last year, WBCSD, together with key member companies and other partners, launched the report called Mapping Nature-Based Solutions and Natural Climate Solutions. You've probably heard this term, nature-based solutions, a lot recently, and there's been a real confusing array of different approaches to this. The report that we put forward tries to take steps to make sure that nature-based solutions are understood correctly by business. It lays out clear definitions and clarifies the scope for nature-based solutions, and in particular, how it builds on the important aspects of natural climate solutions to accelerate consistent and credible actions that are high quality. And this high quality really matters, particularly when we're trying to drive ambition, create integrated solutions, and start to build the investment framework that it will take to achieve these things. Developing and delivering high quality nature-based solutions can and should support achievement of climate and nature and biodiversity goals, as well as supporting people and local communities, providing opportunities for business to invest with consistency and credibility. And it's really important that we keep this aspect of people-centered outcomes at the heart of this decision-making for these high-quality nature-based solutions. In addition, this year, we're going to continue to see the developments of the 2 key frameworks for nature around disclosure and targets: the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and the Science-Based Targets for Nature. Let me just share a few more points on these. We're very happy to say that rapid progress is being made in the preparatory work to launch a task force on nature-related disclosures. This may sound familiar, and that's by design, building on the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures, TCFD. WBCSD and its members, its businesses members, have been actively engaged in this process over the past few months, really with the aim to bring business voice and insights to what it will take for business to be able to create the disclosure processes that are going to drive the transparency and the financial measures that are so important for nature. This work is going to continue over the coming months. The other key piece in development is the Science-Based Targets for Nature. We're continuing to play a role here by engaging the businesses into the Science-Based Target Network through their own actions as well, which has been tremendous. We know that business needs to clear pathways to action. Through our Nature Action Project, we're bringing leading members together to work collaboratively to identify challenges, gaps, and leverage the leadership and best practices of the most advanced companies in the nature agenda. We need this to lay the pathways for other businesses to catch up on their respective nature journeys to help to accelerate this process overall. So as I hope you can see from this quick summary here, there's quite a lot the business community is already doing. There are really important frameworks in development where business is contributing to make sure that when it is ready to move and start to take even further action, it can do so consistently and credibly with those frameworks in place. We're advocating for an ambitious global agreement on nature at the CBD COP15, and we're eager to show how nature and climate come together all the way through into COP26, making sure that we're threading these very common and necessary asks through all of the big events this year. We're really looking forward to our continued work together. Thanks so much again for the opportunity to be here to kick off this exciting 10-day challenge, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion. Guy, back over to you.
Thank you very much there, Diane, for those insights into the global biodiversity agenda and beyond, and particularly all the work that you're doing with business to bring business expertise to bear on the post-2020 framework and share front-runner experience in the business community. That's all so valuable. Now, we'll move on, and next up we have Surya in Cheshire. Ian is a leading light in sustainable development in the UK, having chaired a number of groundbreaking panels and initiatives relating to the role of business in relation to both climate and nature, and currently advises UK government on preparations for the climate COP26 to be held in Glasgow at the end of this year. Ian, I think you'll be focusing on the climate agenda and what it means in terms of business action for nature. So many thanks for finding time to join us, and over to you.
Great. Morning, everybody. Hi there. Good morning, everyone. And it's extremely hard work following Umberto and Diane after that very comprehensive set of opening statements. So I'll probably go a bit narrower because I think particularly Umberto made, if you like, the general case for action. But I think if we sort of say, why should business act, maybe why now, and also how it should really start thinking about acting, because I think a lot of the thought leadership over the last 20 years has been sort of done. We're now into the action leadership, which is what we need to see to make things actually occur on the ground. So I think the why, business understands it's got a responsibility. I very rarely have met a CEO who doesn't take these agendas seriously and want to know what they can do. And it is either direct in the sense of when I was running Kingfisher, the DIY retailer, we had a direct impact, which is that we used a forest the size of Switzerland every year to produce products for sale around the world. And that amount of wood has to be sourced responsibly. But there's also a more broader understanding that in the past, a lot of the externalities that business have sort of subtly relied on haven't really been factored into decision making. And that ultimately we have to take a more holistic view. So I think people are willing to take on that responsibility. And they're also clear, secondly, that there is this transition in the economic model that must ultimately happen in order to both incorporate nature in decision making and come up with a sustainable model for capitalism and more of a circular economy. I think offers huge opportunities to business, and we should be very upfront about it. It also creates threats to existing business models. So there's a defensive and offensive reason to be engaged in this topic and to really understand it. And I think what we've seen is an increasingly deep understanding, but perhaps now comes a moment for action rather than understanding. So the why now, why should business take nature seriously and value nature now, I think is that there has been a long run up to this point. We've had years and years and years of COP, plans and actions. And as Diane said, none of these targets have been particularly well met. And I think there is an understanding that it'll probably be through concerted action rather than just rely on government or just rely on business or just rely on consumers that we'll see a change. Now, compared to the very early days of COP when business wasn't involved back in sort of Rio and even in Paris. I think we're now seeing a much more integrated approach, and I'm very clear that COP26 at Glasgow is going to have a strong business element, which I really welcome, and it needs the joined up thinking. So I think the sort of case starts with the fact is that, you know, a lot of thought leadership has already occurred. There are now also alliances in place, such as We Value Nature, and WBCSD has been very active in promoting a whole set of global initiatives. And I think the difference also is that governments are really looking to act in this place. The thought leadership is permeated there, and I think we're seeing initiatives, particularly around nature-based solutions, which Diane referred to, particularly in the COP26 position led by Lord Goldsmith, who makes the point frequently that of the X now billion, depending on how you count it, of global funding for climate-based solutions, less than 5% is at the moment based on nature-based solutions, and that's the real opportunity. And in particular, that will be a theme for COP26 at Glasgow as to how we can really showcase successful nature-based solutions. And I think when the planets come together like that, and you have alliances of businesses, alliances of government, and a lot of thought leadership, it makes a big difference. But I single out two other factors that have changed and which allow business to go further. One is the financial community has definitely shifted gear, and as was mentioned, TCFD, apologies for those who haven't got all these jargon initials everywhere, but TCFD was a very big deal in the financial community in terms of the people who own companies and invest. And what that's done is it's given permission for a lot of companies who are perhaps hesitant to make the shift and understand what their activities were impacting, and take a much more hands-on role. And that's particularly with initiatives like the BlackRock letter, Larry Fink's letter to the various CEOs around the world. But I think it's emblematic of the idea that the finance community is generally interested as opposed to in a token way. And if I contrast my experience of 7 years of going around investors as CEO and being asked twice, I think, about my sustainability agenda versus now what I've just been through in the boardroom at Barclays, where we've gone through a major overhaul of the investment portfolio, our client portfolio, in order to be in line with Paris commitments. But that's involved detailed work at a level which just simply was inconceivable 10 years ago. So I think the finance community is stepping up to its, and it will continue with TNFD, which is possibly even more complicated than TCFD, and really requires a lot of hard thinking. And that leads me to the final point on on this area, which is the need for methodologies and concrete data and approaches. And the more we can standardize that and have simple frameworks that businesses can use, plug in data, the better. And I was very proud to be involved on part of the advisory panel for the Das Gupta review. And I think that's a really fundamental piece of work that will start to allow us to value nature much more accurately and much more thoughtfully. But I think you will need more and more work on the sort of hard data side of this to allow businesses to really affect change. So the final point on the how, I think it is really critical that all businesses do support these broad initiatives. So the alliance support is critical, and it does help businesses make change if they can have alliances and sort of safety in numbers that shows that this is a general trend. But my overwhelming message for everyone involved is if you're involved in a business, is find your particular way into these issues, because not all companies are involved in all these issues. Obviously, when I was running something, I was very interested in the deforestation agenda which impacts on biodiversity and climate change. Other people will have different issues, and it's a very different world if you're a steel producer versus, say, a technology company. But I think what we have to do is find that supply, the specific areas, and particularly for companies thinking about their supply chain opportunities. And we've just recently had the GRI task force in the UK, which I chaired, which was looking at the direct impact of what happens when you consume products like palm and soya in producer countries, and how do we help that just transition, which very much includes the people involved in those producer countries. And actually there's an enormous amount that people can do in their own supply chains if they are aware of it. And I think finding this sort of, 35,000 feet, we value nature, yes, you can get boards to agree it. The really interesting bit is when you start saying, so that means we need to do this. And I think particularly I'd encourage people to think about supply chains where they can make change through disclosure, telling people what they're doing, our customers and our colleagues are interested about what business will contribute. And we have the opportunity now. So what we have to get to is tangible action as opposed to the warm words that we've seen for many years. But very encouraged to see this event. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to see it, I know the Dasgupta panel will be involved in this next few days. I really encourage you to engage with it. I think it's a great piece of work by Parta and the team. Thank you, Guy. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Ian, and for all that downloading of experience from your deep involvement in business. We will move on to our final panelist, but just before I do that, just a reminder to the audience, please do post questions in the Q&A function in the Zoom, because we will be moving on to a panel session where we can put those questions to our panelists. So we'll move on now to our final panelist, who is Akanksha Khatri, who is the head of the Nature Action Agenda at the World Economic Forum. And Akanksha will focus on issues around business risk and opportunity related to nature. So Akanksha, delighted to have you with us, and over to you.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you for having me and the World Economic Forum on this panel. I think the tough part of being the last panelist is so many good ideas have already been said, so I was taking notes of things that I wanted to cover. But it's also encouraging from the other panelists to see how much consistency is there in the message being sent, and reflective of the momentum that is there in this space today. So I would like to pick up on something very similar to what Sir Ian said. Is the topic for today's session is actually, why should businesses act for nature? And one could argue that this is not a relevant question anymore. So over the past year, because of COVID, it has become very clear that the health of the planet and people is pretty much one and the same thing. Businesses exist within a society, which in turn exists within the biosphere. The same message which has also been put forward by Sir Partha Dasgupta in his review. So today it is a universal imperative to safeguard nature and the planetary health. Last year, the forum introduced its new Nature Economy Report series, the first of which identified that over half the world's GDP, or approximately $44 trillion, is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. So these risks are not only limited to industries reliant on primary commodities, but even sectors like the IT, technology, finance, insurance, and banking. These so-called tertiary sectors, or what we would normally just assume knowledge economy, less to do with nature, are also at the cusp of severe disruption to their business models. Every business, no matter what the sector, has an impact and dependency on nature. And similar to what has been said before, it's not so much about asking the why, but really figuring out that if I am running a business as a CEO or as any business leader, how do I sink my teeth into figuring out my role to play for safeguarding nature? Because nature laws can and should be captured in the enterprise risk management of all companies. And efforts like the TNFD, which other panelists have also highlighted, is going to be critical in mainstreaming this. So our mindset has really shifted over the past few years, that it is not only a conservation agenda, but a mainstream economic agenda. And a concrete example that I could give here is, say, from Swiss Re, which is an insurance and reinsurance company. And today, for every project that they evaluate, there is a layer of carbon levy before deciding the insurance premium. So the two decisions that a board will be taking are today influenced by the impact that those two decisions or the projects are going to have on climate change and nature loss. And similarly, large infrastructure companies are identifying that green-gray infrastructure and investing in natural coastal resilience is critical for the future of their industry. So you cannot stay in business today if nature continues to deteriorate in stock and its ecosystem services. So the other question which Sir Ian had raised was a very critical one that I also wanted to raise, was why this, why now? because we are indeed at tipping points in some of the key biomes, such as the Amazon, the boreal forest, and coral reefs. And nature loss beyond a point has significant irreversible consequences on food security, supply chains, commodities, etc. So if we look around, anything and everything in our life which is serviced by a business is connected to nature. And for businesses that shift towards a nature positive pathway by 2030, there is a $10.1 trillion opportunity across major industry sectors. This was the report that the forum launched in July of last year, called The Future of Nature in Business, pushing forward the point that the two things cannot exist in silo, but are inextricably interlinked. So these opportunities can be seen in the space of circular economy, regenerative farming, vegan and alternative protein sector, and of course, more nature-friendly urban infrastructure design. So repeating the same message that some of my fellow panelists have said is identifying what's happening within my sector and how can I contribute to a net zero nature positive economy. So the question on the minds of corporate CEOs and other business leaders is not why businesses should act on nature, but how businesses can act for nature. And for this, the report that we launched earlier identified 3 socioeconomic sectors which are responsible for almost 80% of nature loss. And these are food, land, and ocean use, infrastructure and the built environment, and extractives and energy. So I hope that all the panelists, all the participants who are in this discussion today, as well as will be joining for the coming 10 days, identify which sector they are a part of and start looking at natural capital as an asset for their business. And in this initiative, I feel like We Value Nature, it plays a key role by dropping the concept of nature positive business to everyday decisions. So if the biggest drivers of nature loss are linked to economic activity, the solution also has to include economic actors in it. What we need is one, consistent and ambitious political will. I think Diane spoke extensively on this, is that more than 500 businesses today have actually signed up to the call by Business for Nature, requiring a more ambitious and consistent and clear post-2020 global biodiversity framework. But I would argue that it also needs to go a little bit further and to look at a more integrated planetary governance. So of course, connect the objectives of climate and nature, but also not forget the third UN convention, which is on desertification, or increasingly being looked at for land. So look at it as an integrated planetary common governance system. The second point is just understanding the value of public-private cooperation and building alliances. We are all living in a post-pandemic world where resources are limited, and there is not as much money on the table for aid or traditional donor engagement. So what it really requires us to unlock market mechanisms which reward and incentivize nature positive behaviors and businesses, as well as remove any harmful subsidies which have existed for decades. So it's like putting public money into destroying public goods. So that thinking needs to be shifted a little bit. And the third piece is on a systems approach across a value chain. So not just looking at what can I do in my specific sphere, but really how do the different industry sectors interact with each other. And I would definitely agree with what Umberto had said earlier. Even an initiative such as the EU taxonomy has had such a positive ripple effect. Like most businesses that I speak to today are paying attention to that taxonomy project because it will impact the way they do business. And similarly, farm to fork strategy is another good example, which looks at the entire value chain of shifting our agriculture system towards a net zero nature positive play. And last but not the least, I could not agree more with what was said earlier, is the finance sector and how we actually ensure that there are incentives for change. And when thinking about the finance community, it's not only the private sector, but also the multilateral development banks. There's just so much more interest today on instruments like debt for nature swaps or incentivizing tropical forested countries to actually protect nature for the benefit of the overall planetary targets, while there are certain industries also looking to decarbonize. So I would leave it over there, but the bigger message is definitely, it's not so much why businesses should act, but really how they can act and how they can scale their efforts to meet our target of 2030 of halting nature loss. Thank you, Guy, and thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, Akanksha, for that. And we'll now then move into a panel session, and we've got 15 or 20 minutes or so to go. I'll just remind our panelists to keep interventions fairly concise so that we can get through a good number of questions. Just a reminder to our audience, please do use the Q&A function. You can put your questions there and use this opportunity to put a question direct to our panelists today. So maybe I can start off with a question to Umberto on the question of markets. Now, the global community and the EU in particular has framed a global market for carbon, and under the Paris Agreement, there is discussion going on in relation to land-based carbon markets. And I wonder what the EU's ambition might be in this regard in relation to framing markets that will allow for investment in nature.
Guys, thank you for the question. Let me start by saying this increased climate ambition we have in the EU, going to 55% reduction of our emissions in the relatively short run, will very clearly require more land-based carbon sinks. So I do think the role of land use change, forestry, and also the EU nature restoration agenda. You're just reminding you, the biodiversity strategy foresees that we will come in 2021 with a legally binding proposal for nature restoration, focusing on the ecosystems that deliver the most for climate. So with this said, I'm not saying that there will be a land-based carbon market coming. What I'm saying is that land-based carbon will become more important. So that opens way for policy developments.
Thank you, Umberto. I wonder, Ian, can you throw any light on how it's looking for land-based carbon markets?
I think it's now a topic that's shooting up the agenda, but unfortunately I do think it's also still tied into the broader question of carbon markets and their functioning. And I think it is a priority area. I think what has shifted is a much better understanding of the opportunity in that space, as opposed to it being seen as something technical to do with EU trade, nets trading, for example. But what we need there is, I think, more, slightly as Umberto's talked about, more practical exemplar type projects where we can document this and test some of the assumptions, because I think it's still not a fully developed set of technologies and frameworks.
Thanks. Perhaps key to business action for nature, a number of you have mentioned it, is the issue of accounting, identifying, measuring, valuing impacts and dependencies. To what extent, and I'm not quite sure who best to put this to, maybe one of you can jump in, to what extent do we need agreed standards in that regard?
Perhaps I can jump in, and then Ian, I can turn it over to you. I think there's two things that are happening right now that several of us spoke to. The TNFD and the Science-Based Target Network are both starting the work towards what are the science-based targets that businesses and cities can be working towards, and TNFD taking steps towards the financial disclosure and transparency that's needed. Those both take time because, Ian, I think it was you who referenced the complexity of these pieces of work underway. We do need to have the established frameworks and the standards. And there is actually quite an acceleration happening on both of these points. Ian, I'll turn it over to you with that because you may have some of those specific examples. Happy to jump in further, Guy, if helpful.
Yeah, I mean, just to make the point that I completely agree with Diana, and someone else in the chat asked, what's the one thing you could do? I mean, if I could pick the alliance point up again, getting involved in TNFD and helping land TNFD with a practical example would be a massive, if you like, alliance level win, as well as finding your own particular nature-based contribution that you think as a business or an organization you can make. But the real point about complexity is that people took a long time to get their head around what a ton of CO2 looked like and even make the science connection for how that affects global warming. When you come up as Partha Dasgupta had to do with some sort of an analysis of biodiversity, the measurements are much more complex and much more sort of difficult to get your head around. So we've I think got to keep grounding it in real detail and find exemplars and things where people can make a difference, and then they can tell stories about how the things are changing, and then it becomes real. But it is a real challenge to go from a top level method, sort of broad framework to actually actionable frameworks. And that's where I think the next few years are critical.
Thanks, Ian. You picked up on a question we've got here from the audience. So from Jared Boss, thanks, Jared. So we've asking, in fact, what is the one thing that a business should do next? And you've already suggested an answer to that, Ian. I'd perhaps put that to our other panelists. If I was a CEO or CFO, what would be the one thing I would do next to take action for nature? Perhaps we can start with you, Akanksha.
Sure. So I think if I had to just pick one thing, it would be mapping the impact and dependency of my business on nature. Similar to how most businesses today have a scope 1, scope 2, and the ambitious ones also scope 3 emission mapping for climate and carbon, we need a similar thing for nature. And I do agree that taking nature at that very high level and then breaking it down to your supply chains is not easy, but you've got to start somewhere. And starting with your supply chains, perhaps even in the land and in more like a jurisdiction space, could be the first step forward.
Great, thanks, Akanksha. Let me turn then to Diane. What would be your recommendation for the one?
I totally agree with Akanksha. I would have added the same thing. This understanding, businesses really have learned so much about the details of their supply chains and value chains through the work they've been doing on carbon, that starting to apply that now to these high-risk scenario areas for nature is absolutely the next step. The one thing I would add is we need to remember to keep people at the center of this as well, because there are people who are relying very much on these ecosystems in which we have high-risk decision-making, and the businesses have sometimes the best visibility to where those opportunities are to support those communities through these types of steps that can be taken. That then leads to higher level quality investments into nature. And they don't have to just be for carbon trading and land, but it can be for land use decision-making as supply chains continue to evolve and as business takes on more risk-based decision-making. So some very important steps that can be taken there.
Thank you, Diane. And Humberto, is there one thing, would it be the same thing or would it be something slightly different?
Largely the same with a bit of complement. First, I do agree, biodiversity is much more complex than, let's say, measuring CO2 emissions or concentrations. But here, what I would do would be to identify a methodology for natural capital accounting, including biodiversity for sure, but tackling air, water, land, sea, if that's the case. I wouldn't be too worried on not being a fully perfect methodology, but something that would give me as a corporate decision maker numbers from which I could decide, incorporate into my business decision making. Now, I would add to this, the complement is I would do something else. One is trying to find what are the nature-based solutions that I can apply to my business. Maybe there are some that usually bring some savings and it gets very much tuned with what we need for biodiversity overall. And I would look to these alliances of businesses that take into account COP26 COP15 in order to bring in whatever commitments or positions that help also for the global agenda that business will also need.
Many thanks for that. I'll pick up on, there's a question just coming from Peter Young, but I'll come back to that in a second. I'd like to quickly ask, there's a tendency in these conversations to focus on action by corporates. But as we know, SMEs are a major part of the EU economy. That's 90% of the EU economy. What would be your recommendation to SMEs trying to grapple with this with perhaps far less resource to do so, and why it is also pertinent for SMEs? Perhaps I could go first to Ian on that one.
Look, I mean, I think the SME sector's got a really vital role to play, and equally the big corporates deal with a lot of SMEs, and so there is a sort of natural self-interest here. And while they don't necessarily have the sort of big corporate resources, they've often got greater agility and the opportunity to innovate faster. So I think there are other strengths that the SME sector can bring to this. And again, as everyone has said, I think the challenge I would put out to businesses of every size is, what's your impact and do you understand it? And I completely agree with Humberto's point that the perfect should not be the enemy of the good here. It is better to get to an 80-20 action, and for each business to work out what it is. And for an SME, there'll be things that they can do and opportunities. And I think thinking about this in the SME space as what opportunities do these changes bring and what can I do in it, I think will be a great challenge to the sort of entrepreneurial capabilities of the sector. Many thanks.
I'm gonna jump to one more question here, because we don't have a lot of time left, and I think this is a very pertinent question coming in from Peter Young. He says, hasn't fisheries management shown that relying on self-interest by business will not restore nature in time? What bigger carrot or stick would the panel suggest? What about a global nature use tariff based on natural capital accounting? So I think it's an issue of a question around, should we be expecting businesses to compensate in some way, to offset in some way their impacts on nature? Humberto, is that something the EU might consider, some kind of tariff or compensation regime for big corporates based on accounting?
Well, let me say, I like the question. In these fisheries is an interesting example when we cannot just hope, let's say, the market or businesses to solve the issue. There's this tragedy of the commons, which is well known. That's why we need governments at several levels, local, regional, and global. And in that sense, is just to stay on the fisheries example, is clearer now that when we can get into a consensus with stakeholders, including fishermen, on allowing a restriction in some areas, no-take zones, well, everyone benefits in the surroundings of the no-take zone, because a fish that doubles in size doesn't just give the double of eggs and larvae, it gives 10 times more. So there's this element. Now, on going for a tariff based on natural capital, I see the intellectual appeal of it. I think we are very far from that. We are still discussing potential carbon taxes, So, but it's an avenue that we should all interested on this, and including policymakers, not take out of our minds in the midterm.
Thanks, Humberto. And I'm going to put it also to Diane. Carrot, stick, tariffs. What's your thought from a business perspective?
This is one of those areas where policy coherence is really important and can make a very significant difference, because we have good players and we've got bad players in the business world. And by driving through the policy piece, we can accelerate some of the actions of the bad players and bring everybody up to the same standards faster. But we also see opportunities. And by the way, I would add that is part of the asks that the business leaders in Business for Nature are making in their consistent space, which is ensuring policy coherence and seeking the right types of reforms to subsidies and incentive schemes, not all of which have to be only tariffs, but these things can have a really big impact. So we would support those.
Thanks, Dan. Ian, would you like to have a quick response to Peter's question?
Yeah, and I'd agree with Humberto. I think the intellectual logic of that is unanswerable. The pragmatic reality is we are a long way from it. But I think business needs to understand that it won't be able to solve some of these issues. There will be governmental frameworks that are necessary. And I think rather than run away from it, business should seek to embrace it and ask for specific change that's well thought through. And this is a long tradition going back to sort of banning the importation of illegal timber, for example, which the EU stepped up to. That as long as we have the level playing field, business should not be worried about that. And I think there will need to be some sticks as well as carrots. Thank
you so much. Now, I'm afraid, I mean, this panel debate could have gone on a lot longer, and I'm sure we could have had a lot more interesting discussion, but I'm afraid we are out of time, and I need to hand over to Katja and Isabel to give a little bit of pragmatic information about the rest of the 10-day challenge. So I'd like to thank so much 4 panelists, Diane, Akanksha, Humberto, and Ian. Thanks so much for giving us your time this morning. This has been recorded. We'll be sharing it more widely, and I hope our audience has found it inspiring and informative. Thank you so much, and I'll hand over to Katja.
Thank you so much, Guy. And wow, what a great way to kick off this 10-day challenge event with such inspiring words from all of the panelists. So thank you so much. I'd like to just share a bit of more practical information for the next 10 days to come. I think we've heard from every panelist this morning that we need to gear towards action. And that is exactly what we're trying to do and achieve through this 10-day challenge event. So beyond suggesting a series of more than 40 practical sessions that are going to be very action-oriented, we also really want to challenge all of you guys throughout the 10 days to actually take concrete small steps towards nature. So that's why we're going to be launching, as of today, 1 challenge each day, so a total of 10 challenges for you to take. The first challenge for today will actually ask you to reflect on where you are on your nature journey and what that means for your company or your organization. And so to do so, it's very simple. You can simply register for these challenges and take part in them through our website, through our event website. And James is going to also drop the link for you into the chat. And then finally, I also want to raise another important platform that we're going to be using throughout the 10 days, which is called the Capitals Community. It's essentially a networking platform with already an amazing set of people, experts, organizations, and is really going to be the space that we will be using for you to continue the discussions after each session. So if you have additional questions coming up for the panelists today or any other speakers that will be coming throughout the 10 days, this will really be the space for you to continue exchanging and hopefully come to amazing collaborations. We've heard this as well from our panelists. We need to come together as alliances, as a group of people to really drive change. So hopefully this community space will be a space where we can enable that. And finally, we will want to ask for your feedback throughout the 10 days. So we also have a specific link for you to respond and give feedback on each of the sessions. We heard a lot about the descriptive review, so I just thought I would shout out that the next upcoming session, right after this one, as of now actually, will be on the economics of biodiversity, going through the descriptive review. So that's it for me. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Katja, and we'll just hand over quickly to Isabel.
Yeah, just very quickly, I wanted to tell you about the challenge that we're putting to the young professionals working with business and natural capital over the 10 days. So our call to action is very simple. We need more young voices in this field, and we need a different perspective on the barriers and the solutions. So look for our tweets, respond to the challenges, and join us at the closing plenary at the end of the 10 days, where we've brought together a group of amazing young professionals who are going to share their visions of what a socially just, nature-positive economy looks like. So hope to see you all there.
Thank you, Isabel and Katja. So that brings our session to a close. We Value Nature will be hosting a midway plenary, 9 o'clock CET on Wednesday, the 17th of March, in conversation with Mark Goff, the Chief Executive of the Capitals Coalition. Do sign up for that. And as Isabel has just mentioned, a closing plenary on the Wednesday, the 24th at 1700 Central European Time. Do sign up for that too, with our a session with our young professionals. Meanwhile, allow me to encourage you then to jump straight into the next session this morning, just starting now with the Dasgupta review team. So if you're interested in that, please, you can register for that on our website and join straight away. So goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us.